The Vietnam War, a nightmare that burned through jungles, cities, and souls. A war where rain mixed with blood, and every heartbeat echoed the sound of gunfire. Fought inch by inch in the mud, the chaos, and the fire, it pushed men to the edge of what humanity could endure. Some battles became legends, others were buried in silence. But today, we're bringing them back. 5 campaigns that defined an era, where courage met catastrophe, and the line between victory and survival disappeared in the smoke. From the desperate stand in the Ia Drang Valley, where air cavalry met the enemy head-on in the first major clash of the war, to Operation Rolling Thunder, the relentless bombing campaign that tried to break North Vietnam's spirit, but only hardened its resolve. Then came the Tet Offensive, when fire and fury erupted across every city in South Vietnam, shattering the illusion that victory was near. In the ancient streets of Hue, Marines and NVA soldiers fought house to house, turning the citadel into a graveyard of stone and steel. And finally, the Easter Offensive, North Vietnam's massive gamble that would rewrite the final chapter of the war. These are not just stories of war. They're stories of men who refused to break, of battles that changed history, and of courage the world almost forgot. Before we begin, take a moment. For the ones who fought, bled, and never came home. Because remembering them is the least we can do. November 14, 1965. Central Highlands, South Vietnam. 10:48 a.m. The jungle air hangs thick and wet, smells like rotting vegetation mixed with aviation fuel. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Gregory Moore, 43 years old, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, steps from the lead Huey helicopter onto a patch of elephant grass at Landing Zone X-ray. The rotor wash flattens the grass in violent circles. His boots sink 2 inches into the red clay soil. Behind him, 15 more helicopters circle like dragonflies, waiting their turn to drop men into this clearing at the base of the Chu Pong Massif. Moore doesn't know it yet. None of the 450 American soldiers descending into this valley know that within the next 90 minutes, they'll be fighting for their lives against 1,600 North Vietnamese Army regulars who have been watching them land. What happens in the next 4 days will write the playbook for 8 more years of American war in Vietnam, and that playbook will be dead wrong. The rotors fade, the jungle goes quiet, too quiet, then the first shot cracks through the trees. By the end of this story, you'll understand how America won every tactical battle at Ia Drang and still lost the war. You'll see how technology triumphed and strategy failed. You'll witness the moment General Westmoreland decided body counts could win wars, and how that decision killed 58,000 American soldiers over the next decade. This isn't a lecture about policy. This is the story of men who fought brilliantly with the wrong mission. If stories like this matter to you, the forgotten truths that textbooks skip, drop a like and let's dig into the jungle. 3 months earlier in Hanoi, Senior General Vo Nguyen Giap, the man who crushed the French at Dien Bien Phu, sits in a war room studying maps of South Vietnam's Central Highlands. His plan is elegant and brutal. Mass 3 full regiments of the People's Army of Vietnam near the Cambodian border, slice through the Central Highlands like a knife through the belly of South Vietnam, cut the country in half, and break American resolve before Washington can commit fully to the war. The 66th Regiment, the 33rd Regiment, and the 32nd Regiment, nearly 4,000 seasoned fighters, begin moving into positions around the Ia Drang Valley in October 1965. They dig fighting positions. They cache ammunition. They wait. General William Westmoreland, commanding all U.S. forces in Vietnam from his air-conditioned headquarters in Saigon, sees the enemy concentration through intelligence reports and decides this is exactly what he's been waiting for. A chance to bring the North Vietnamese into open battle where American firepower can destroy them. For months, the enemy has been fighting guerrilla style, hit and run, ambush and fade. Westmoreland has helicopters, artillery that can drop shells 20 miles away, B-52 bombers carrying 30 tons of explosives each, and the best trained infantry on Earth. All he needs is for the enemy to stand and fight. He orders the 1st Cavalry Division, America's first and only air-mobile division, designed specifically for helicopter assault, to find the enemy and engage them. The division's soldiers have been in country for exactly 60 days. They're confident. Their equipment is new. Their training is the most advanced in military history. Most of them are between 19 and 23 years old. November 14th arrives with crystal-clear skies, perfect flying weather. At 6:30 hours, 1601, Huey, helicopters lift off from Camp Holloway carrying Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. The flight takes 17 minutes. The landing zone, designated X-ray on the maps, is a football field-sized clearing of elephant grass surrounded by thick jungle and overlooked by the Chu Pong Massif, a mountain that straddles the Cambodian border. Intelligence suggests enemy activity in the area. What intelligence doesn't know is that approximately 1,600 North Vietnamese soldiers from the 66th Regiment are dug into positions less than 500 meters from the landing zone, watching the helicopters approach. Moore steps off the lead bird at 10:48. Within 2 minutes, 80 men are on the ground, forming a defensive perimeter. The helicopters pull up and away, rotors screaming, to fetch the next lift. The Americans begin moving into the tree line. 10:52 a.m. Specialist 4 Bill Beck, a rifleman from Georgia, 21 years old, pushes through waist-high grass toward a cluster of trees 50 meters west of the landing zone. He sees movement. He raises his M16. A North Vietnamese soldier rises from a spider hole 10 feet away and fires first. Beck drops, shot through the chest. The bullet exits his back, shattering his shoulder blade. He's the first American casualty at Ia Drang. He won't be the last. Within seconds, the jungle erupts. AK-47 fire pours from 3 sides. Mortar rounds start walking across the landing zone. The North Vietnamese have sprung a textbook ambush. They let the first wave land, waited for the helicopters to leave, and attacked before reinforcements could arrive. Moore grabs his radio handset, calls for gunship support, artillery, and more troops. The next helicopter lift, already inbound, flies directly into a firestorm. Captain John Herron, 29, commanding Bravo Company, screams orders over the gunfire. His men drop into the grass and return fire. They can't see the enemy, just muzzle flashes in the green wall of jungle. The North Vietnamese are firing from prepared positions, from trees, from tunnels. They're not running. They're advancing. Senior Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huen, commanding the 66th Regiment from a command post 300 meters away, orders wave attacks. His soldiers charge in groups of 20 and 30, blowing whistles, firing on full automatic, determined to overrun the tiny American perimeter before it can be reinforced. Moore's radio operator, Specialist 4 Bob Owlett, crouches next to him in the grass, relaying coordinates for artillery fire. The first shells scream in 60 seconds after request, 105 mm rounds from Fire Support Base Falcon, 12 miles east. The shells impact 200 meters west, shredding jungle and men. Moore adjusts fire, walking the explosions closer to the American perimeter. Some rounds land so close the concussion lifts him off the ground. By 11:20 a.m., the landing zone is a killing ground. Dead and wounded Americans lie scattered in the grass. Helicopters are taking fire on approach, but they keep coming, pilots gritting teeth, hands steady on the cyclic, dropping men into hell and pulling out wounded on the return trip. Moore now has 200 men on the ground. The North Vietnamese have committed at least 500 to the assault. The math is bad. And then the sky opens up with salvation. Major Bruce Crandall, 35, a helicopter pilot with the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion, flying an unarmed Huey with the call sign Ancient Serpent 6, makes his 4th trip into X-ray at 11:35 a.m. Tracer rounds arc past his windscreen. His door gunners return fire with M60 machine guns, the hammering roar so loud it vibrates the entire airframe. Crandall sets the Huey down in a cloud of red dust, and medics throw 5 wounded men aboard in under 20 seconds. He pulls pitch and climbs out through a swarm of green tracers. One round punches through the tail boom. Crandall doesn't flinch. He'll make 18 more trips into X-ray that day, evacuating 70 wounded, delivering ammunition and water. He does this without gunship escort because every armed helicopter is busy keeping the perimeter from collapsing. For this, 42 years later, Crandall will receive the Medal of Honor. But right now, on November 14, 1965, he's just flying and praying. Captain Ed Freeman, 44, Crandall's wingman, flies alongside him on every run. Freeman is older than most pilots. He flew Mustangs in World War II, got out, then re-enlisted for Korea and Vietnam. He's calm under fire the way only old soldiers can be. While Crandall evacuates wounded, Freeman brings in ammunition cases and water cans, the unglamorous logistics that keep infantrymen alive. On his 14th trip, a bullet destroys his hydraulic system. Freeman wrestles the crippled Huey back to base, gets a new bird and returns to X-ray. He'll also receive the Medal of Honor posthumously in 2001. By 1:00 p.m., Moore has his full battalion on the ground, 450 men in a perimeter roughly the size of a Walmart parking lot, surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbers them 3-1. The North Vietnamese attack in human waves. Moore's men cut them down with M16 rifle fire, M60 machine gun bursts, and M79 grenade launchers. American artillery falls in continuous thunder, shells every 30 seconds, shaking the earth, turning jungle into splinters. The fighting is so close that some Americans are killed by their own shrapnel. Moore orders artillery to danger close range. Explosions 100 meters from his forward positions. The alternative is being overrun. At 2:15 p.m., Lieutenant Henry Herrick, 24, leading a platoon on the southern edge of the perimeter, pursues a small group of retreating North Vietnamese soldiers into the jungle. It's a fatal mistake. Herrick's platoon walks into a horseshoe ambush, North Vietnamese soldiers hidden in the trees on 3 sides. They open fire at point-blank range. Herrick is shot through the head and dies instantly. His men dive for cover, pinned down, isolated from the main perimeter, surrounded. They'll stay trapped there for the next 14 hours. Every attempt to reach them draws withering fire. This is the moment the North Vietnamese learn the tactic that will define the rest of the war. Grab them by the belt buckle. Senior Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huyen, observing the battle, realizes that American artillery and air support are devastating, but only when the two forces are separated. If his soldiers can close to within arm's reach of the Americans, the artillery becomes useless. American commanders won't risk killing their own men. So he orders his troops to charge straight into the American positions, to grapple hand-to-hand, to make it impossible for the enemy to call and fire support. It works. Sections of the perimeter become knife fights. Americans club North Vietnamese soldiers with rifle butts. Grenades explode in foxholes, killing attacker and defender together. As the sun sets on November 14th, the perimeter at X-ray is holding barely. American casualties, 18 dead, 49 wounded. Estimated North Vietnamese casualties, more than 200 dead, uncounted wounded. The jungle around the landing zone is carpeted with bodies. Moore knows reinforcements are coming. He also knows the North Vietnamese aren't retreating. They're regrouping. The real battle is just beginning. Night falls like a curtain. Moore orders his men to dig in and prepare for human wave assaults. The North Vietnamese prefer night fighting. It negates American air superiority and artillery accuracy. But Moore has a weapon the enemy didn't anticipate. At 9:00 p.m., 20 miles above the South China Sea, 3 Boeing B-52 Stratofortress bombers bank toward the Ia Drang Valley. Each bomber carries 108 500-pound bombs, more than 30 tons of high explosives per aircraft. This is Operation Arclight, the first tactical use of strategic bombers in direct support of ground troops in combat. The B-52 was designed to drop nuclear weapons on Soviet cities. Tonight, it will drop conventional bombs on jungle. The bombers release their payloads from 30,000 feet. The soldiers at X-ray don't hear them coming. The first explosion is a flash of white light 2 miles west, followed by a rolling earthquake that shakes the ground beneath Moore's boots. Then another, and another. For 6 minutes, the jungle west of X-ray is transformed into a moonscape. Trees 100 feet tall are vaporized. The concussion kills men a quarter mile from impact. North Vietnamese soldiers preparing to attack are obliterated where they stand. When the bombing stops, the jungle is silent except for the screams of the wounded. November 15th, dawn. The perimeter at X-ray is reinforced overnight. 2 additional companies airlifted in, bringing Moore's strength to nearly 700 men. The North Vietnamese have also been reinforced. Elements of the 33rd Regiment arrive from the west, bringing enemy strength to approximately 2,000. The fight resumes at first light. The North Vietnamese attack in waves of 50 to 100 soldiers, screaming, blowing bugles, throwing grenades ahead of them. Moore's men meet them with interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The M60 machine gun, nicknamed the Pig, fires 550 rounds per minute. At close range, the heavy 7.62 bullets tear through multiple bodies. Gun barrels glow red-hot. Soldiers pour canteen water over them to cool the metal. Some barrels warp from the heat and have to be replaced. The artillery never stops. Forward observers call in fire missions every 3 minutes. Shells arch in from fire support base Falcon like clockwork. 105 mm high explosive, white phosphorus and variable time fuse rounds that detonate above the ground, spraying shrapnel downward. The North Vietnamese suffer horrific casualties, but they don't break. They don't retreat. They keep coming. Lieutenant Rick Riscorla, 26, a platoon leader from Cornwall, England, serving in the U.S. Army, sings Cornish battle songs to keep his men calm under fire. Men of Cornwall, stand ye steady. It cannot be ever said ye for the battle we're not ready, he bellows over the gunfire. His soldiers think he's insane, but it works. They hold their section of the perimeter through 6 separate assaults. By midday November 15th, the isolated platoon, Herrick's men, now led by Sergeant Ernie Savage, is still trapped 150 meters south of the main perimeter. Dead Americans lie stacked as sandbag walls. The living are down to 3 magazines of ammunition each. Moore orders another rescue attempt. Alpha Company, led by Captain Tony Nadel, fights yard by yard through thick jungle, taking casualties with every step. It takes 4 hours to cover 150 meters. When they finally reach Savage's position at 4:30 p.m., only 29 of the original 50 men are still alive. Savage, wounded 3 times, refused to leave his men. He'll survive the war and retire as a sergeant major. November 16th, the 3rd day. The North Vietnamese pull back during the night, dragging their dead with them. Moore's perimeter expands. Helicopter resupply runs bring in ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Medevac birds lift out the wounded. The death toll stands at 79 Americans killed, 121 wounded. North Vietnamese dead litter the battlefield, counted in the hundreds, estimated in the thousands. Moore's artillery fire has been so accurate and sustained that whole sections of jungle are burning. The smell is unbearable. Cordite, blood, burning flesh. This is the moment General Westmoreland decides the strategy works. The 1st Cavalry Division has met a numerically superior force in open battle and crushed it through superior firepower and mobility. The casualty ratio is approximately 12-1 in America's favor. Westmoreland sends a congratulatory message to Moore. An outstanding victory. He orders more search and destroy missions. He requests more troops. He begins to calculate the crossover point. The moment when American kills will exceed North Vietnamese ability to replace losses. leading to inevitable enemy collapse. It's a formula for disaster. On November 17th, Moore's battalion is ordered to march overland from LZ X-ray to a new landing zone designated Albany, 2 miles northeast. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade's 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, will take over security at X-ray and then follow Moore. The brass believes the battle is over. Intelligence reports suggest the North Vietnamese have withdrawn across the border into Cambodia. The march to LZ Albany is supposed to be a routine movement. It's anything but. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huyen did not withdraw. He repositioned. While Moore's battalion marched northeast toward Albany and moved reserve units from the 66th Regiment into ambush positions along the route. He learned from X-ray. He learned that American firepower dominates open engagements, so he planned the opposite, a close-range ambush in thick jungle where artillery and air support would be useless. At 1:15 p.m. on November 17th, McDade's column, roughly 450 men stretched out in a single-file line nearly half a mile long, walks directly into An's Trap. The North Vietnamese attack from both sides simultaneously. The first soldiers to die never see their killers. AK-47 fire erupts from distances of 10 feet. Americans and North Vietnamese soldiers are so intermingled that calling in artillery or airstrikes would kill as many friendlies as enemies. The column disintegrates into isolated pockets of men fighting hand-to-hand in the jungle. Specialist 4 Jack Smith, 20, a rifleman from New York, later describes the chaos. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Men were screaming, bleeding, dying all around me. I couldn't see 10 feet. I fired my rifle until it jammed. Then I picked up a dead man's rifle and kept firing. The fighting lasts 4 hours. When it ends, 155 Americans are dead and 124 are wounded, more than a third of the battalion. North Vietnamese losses are estimated at over 400, but they achieve their objective. They prove that American firepower can be negated through tactics. Senior Lieutenant Colonel and later writes in his memoir, "We learned that helicopters brought the Americans to battle quickly, but once on the ground, they fought as infantry, and infantry can be ambushed." November 18th. The Battle of Ia Drang ends. The Americans evacuate LZ Albany and X-ray, leaving behind scorched earth and mass graves. B-52s bomb the area for 3 more days to ensure the North Vietnamese can't claim the ground. The official casualty count: 305 Americans killed, 524 wounded. North Vietnamese casualties are listed as 3,561 killed, though this number is almost certainly inflated. The true figure is unknowable. General Westmoreland declares Ia Drang a decisive American victory. He uses it as proof that air mobility works, that American firepower is overwhelming, and that the enemy will break if enough pressure is applied. The search and destroy strategy becomes official doctrine. Body count becomes the primary metric of success. Commanders are evaluated not on territory held, not on political progress, but on how many enemy soldiers they kill. In Hanoi, Senior General Giap studies the battle reports and draws the opposite conclusion. He writes, "The Americans can win every battle and still lose the war. They measure success in bodies. We measure success in will. We will outlast them." Both men are right. Over the next 3 years, American forces will kill tens of thousands of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers. Casualty ratios will consistently favor the U.S. by margins of 10-1 or higher, and it won't matter. The North Vietnamese leadership accepts losses that would break any Western military. They replace casualties faster than the Americans can inflict them. They refuse to fight on American terms. They ambush. They fade. They strike when conditions favor them and withdraw when they don't. The crossover point never comes. By 1968, after the Tet Offensive, American public support for the war collapses. By 1973, U.S. combat troops withdraw. By 1975, Saigon falls. Ia Drang set the template. Helicopters delivering troops into remote jungle, artillery called in coordinates radioed from the front, B-52s turning forest into craters, body counts reported up the chain, medals awarded, casualties replaced. Repeat. It worked tactically, it failed strategically. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore survives Vietnam and retires as a lieutenant general. He spends the rest of his life haunted by the men who died under his command. In 1993, he travels to Hanoi and meets Senior Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huyen for the first time since the battle. The two old soldiers drink tea and talk for hours, and tells Moore, "You were a worthy enemy. Your soldiers fought bravely, but your leaders did not understand the war they were fighting." Moore doesn't disagree. Major Bruce Crandall and Captain Ed Freeman, the helicopter pilots who flew into hell 22 times to save wounded men, both received the Medal of Honor, though Freeman's comes posthumously in 2001. Crandall, accepting his medal in 2007, says simply, "I just flew the helicopter. The real heroes are the men who stayed on the ground." The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, the unit that fought at Little Bighorn in 1876, adds Ia Drang to its battle streamers. The unit fights for 7 more years in Vietnam. It never suffers losses as severe as LZ Albany again. But the war grinds on, and men keep dying, and the body counts keep climbing, and the strategy never changes. Because Ia Drang taught the American military the wrong lesson. It taught them that technology and firepower win wars. It didn't teach them that wars are won by strategy, by politics, by patience, by understanding the enemy's will. And that's the tragedy. America's first major battle in Vietnam was a tactical masterpiece and a strategic catastrophe. The men who fought there, American and North Vietnamese alike, performed with extraordinary courage and skill. But courage and skill don't win wars when the strategy is flawed. Ia Drang was the blueprint for disaster, written in blood on a jungle floor, celebrated as victory, and repeated until defeat. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it. These soldiers, Moore's men at X-Ray, McDade's men at Albany, Crandall and Freeman in the sky, Nguyen Huyen's troops in the jungle, they all deserve to be remembered for what they endured. January 31st, 1968, 2:33 a.m. The ancient citadel of Hue, Vietnam. Lance Corporal Robert Toms, 19 years old from Kansas, stands guard duty at the MACV compound south of the Perfume River. The night air smells like incense and fish sauce from the street vendors who packed up hours ago. Toms can hear fireworks exploding across the city, Tet celebrations, Vietnamese New Year, the biggest holiday of the year. His M16 feels heavy in his hands. He's been in country for 6 weeks. His sergeant told him Tet would be quiet, a ceasefire, they said, everyone's celebrating. Then Tom sees movement in the street, not civilians, soldiers, dozens of them, wearing North Vietnamese army uniforms, carrying AK-47s, running toward the compound. The fireworks weren't fireworks. They were rockets. The war just came to the city. What happens in the next 33 days will destroy 80% of Vietnam's ancient imperial capital, displace over 100,000 civilians, and shatter the illusion that America is winning this war. The Battle of Hue won't be fought in jungles or rice paddies. It'll be fought house to house, room by room, through narrow streets where helicopters can't maneuver and artillery kills as many civilians as enemies. This is urban warfare at its most brutal. And every second of it will be televised back to America. By the end of this story, you'll understand how the communists captured a city with 12,000 soldiers in 6 hours, how American Marines fought for a month to take it back, and how 3,000 civilians were executed in mass graves that nobody talked about until the bodies were found. If you want war stories that don't hide the truth, hit that like button and let's walk into the Citadel. 6 months earlier, Hanoi, North Vietnam. Senior General Vo Nguyen Giap sits in a windowless room studying maps of South Vietnam. Giap is 56 years old, a legend. the man who defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. His plan for 1968 is simple and insane. Attack every major city in South Vietnam simultaneously during Tet, the one holiday when both sides traditionally observe a ceasefire. The objective isn't to hold territory. It's to break American will. If the communists can show they're strong enough to attack everywhere at once, American public opinion will collapse. The war will end through negotiation, not conquest. Hue is the crown jewel of this plan. Population 140,000, the ancient imperial capital, the citadel, a walled fortress built in 1804 with walls 15 feet tall and 12 feet thick, sits on the north bank of the Perfume River. Inside the citadel are the tombs of Vietnamese emperors, government offices, and narrow streets that date back centuries. Capturing Hue will be symbolic. Holding it will be a propaganda victory. Giap assigns 3 full NVA regiments to the attack, the 4th, 5th, and 6th, approximately 12,000 soldiers. They'll infiltrate the city over weeks, hiding weapons in homes, preparing attack routes, waiting for the signal. American intelligence knows something is coming. Captured documents mention a major offensive during Tet, but nobody believes the enemy is capable of attacking multiple cities simultaneously. The prevailing wisdom in Saigon is that the communists are too weak, too degraded by 3 years of bombing and search and destroy operations. General William Westmoreland, commanding all U.S. forces in Vietnam, tells reporters that the enemy is on the ropes. Tet will be quiet, he says. A ceasefire. Time to relax. January 30th, 1968. Hue. The city is packed with civilians celebrating Tet. Families feast. Fireworks explode. Street markets overflow with food and decorations. The American presence in Hue is small, fewer than 200 personnel, mostly military advisors stationed at the MACV compound on the south side of the Perfume River. The South Vietnamese 1st Infantry Division, approximately 3,000 soldiers, guards key installations and the citadel. Nobody expects trouble. The ceasefire is in effect. Both sides have agreed to pause fighting for the holiday. Then midnight comes. The ceasefire expires, and 12,000 North Vietnamese soldiers attack from 4 directions simultaneously. 2:33 a.m. Lance Corporal Tom sees the first wave hit the MACV compound. Rockets slam into the perimeter. AK-47 fire rakes the walls. Toms drops behind sandbags and returns fire. Tracers arc through the dark like red fireflies. The compound radio operator screams into the handset. "We're under attack. We need reinforcements." But reinforcements are miles away at Phu Bai Combat Base, south of the city. The road between Phu Bai and Hue is already blocked by NVA forces. Toms and the 200 Americans at MACV are surrounded. Inside the citadel, the South Vietnamese 1st Infantry Division headquarters comes under attack. NVA sappers blow holes in the citadel walls with satchel charges. Infantry pours through. The South Vietnamese fight back, but they're outnumbered and unprepared. Within 3 hours, the NVA controls most of the citadel. They raise the Viet Cong flag red and blue with a yellow star above the walls. Communist political officers move through neighborhoods with prepared lists of names. South Vietnamese government officials, police officers, military personnel, teachers, intellectuals, anyone considered a threat to communist rule. These people are arrested. Many are taken to schoolyards, pagodas, and open fields. They're shot or buried alive. The executions begin before dawn and continue for days. An estimated 3,000 civilians will be killed in these massacres, though nobody in America knows it yet. The focus is on the battle, not the war crime happening in the shadows. By 6:00 a.m., the NVA controls 80% of Hue. The South Vietnamese hold a small section of the citadel. The Americans at MACV are besieged but holding. The city is burning. Civilians flee into streets filled with gunfire. Families huddle in basements. Children scream. The ancient capital, which had survived centuries of warfare, is being torn apart in hours. At Fubai Combat Base, Brigadier General Foster Lahu receives reports and can't believe them. The entire city of Hue is under attack. Impossible. Intelligence said the enemy was weak, but the radio reports keep coming. MACV is surrounded. The citadel has fallen. South Vietnamese forces are collapsing. Lahu orders an immediate response. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, 160 men commanded by Captain Gordon Batchelor, loads onto trucks and heads north toward Hue. They have no idea they're driving into a month-long nightmare. The convoy moves north on Highway 1. It's 8:00 a.m., January 31st. Captain Batchelor rides in the lead truck. His Marines are relaxed. Most of them think this is a quick reaction force responding to a small attack. They've been told the city is partially occupied. What they don't know is that 12,000 enemy soldiers are waiting for them. The convoy crosses a bridge 2 miles south of Hue. Then the world explodes. NVA soldiers hidden in buildings on both sides of the highway open fire. RPGs slam into trucks. Marines bail out and dive into ditches. Batchelor screams orders over the gunfire. His radio man is hit in the chest and goes down. Batchelor grabs the radio handset and calls for air support, but helicopters can't get close. The anti-aircraft fire is too heavy. The Marines are pinned down, taking casualties, fighting an enemy they can't see. It takes 3 hours to fight 2 miles into the city. By the time Alpha Company reaches the MACV compound, they've lost 14 men killed and dozens wounded. The fighting is unlike anything these Marines have experienced. In the jungle, you can call in artillery and airstrikes. In the city, those weapons are useless. Too much risk of civilian casualties, too many buildings providing cover. This is close-quarters combat. Kick in a door, throw a grenade, clear the room, move to the next building. Repeat all day, all night. Lance Corporal Tom, still alive at MACV, watches Alpha Company arrive and feels relief for the first time in 6 hours. The compound is secure, but the rest of the city is enemy territory. The citadel, the symbolic heart of Hue, is flying the Viet Cong flag, and General Lahu is ordering the Marines to take it back. February 1st. The Marines begin pushing north toward the Perfume River and the citadel. The fighting is street by street. Every building has to be cleared. NVA snipers hide in upper stories and pick off anyone who moves. Machine guns cover intersections. Crossing a street means sprinting through a wall of bullets. The Marines adapt. They use tanks to blast holes in walls so they can move building to building without exposing themselves to sniper fire. They call in Huey gunships to strafe rooftops. They throw grenades into every room before entering. The casualty rate is brutal. By February 3rd, Alpha Company has lost half its strength. The South Vietnamese forces, reinforced by additional battalions, begin fighting to retake the citadel on the north side of the river. The citadel is a fortress, walls built to withstand 19th century artillery. NVA soldiers shelter behind the walls and fire from protected positions. The South Vietnamese advance meter by meter. Buildings collapse from tank fire. Artillery shells crater streets. Civilians trapped in the city hide in basements and pagodas, praying not to be crushed by collapsing buildings or hit by stray bullets. Sergeant Alfredo Gonzalez, a 21-year-old Marine from Texas, leads his squad through the streets near the Perfume River on February 4th. Gonzalez is a veteran, 13 months in-country, multiple combat actions. His men trust him. They're clearing a block of shops when an NVA machine gun opens fire from a second-story window. Gonzalez's point man drops, hit in the leg. The squad dives for cover. The machine gun keeps firing, pinning them down. Gonzalez doesn't hesitate. He grabs a law rocket, a disposable anti-tank weapon, sprints across the street under fire, aims, and destroys the machine gun nest with one shot. Then he runs back to drag his wounded point man to safety. The rest of the squad advances. Gonzalez is hit by sniper fire an hour later and dies before the medevac arrives. He'll receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. His body count that day, 0. His impact, immeasurable. If brutal stories like this one are what you're here for, The real cost of war, not the sanitized version. Tap that like button. These Marines deserve to be remembered for more than statistics. February 10th. The Marines control most of the south side of Hue, but progress is measured in blocks, not miles. The city is a ruin. 80% of structures are damaged or destroyed. Over 100,000 civilians have fled, most walking south with whatever they could carry, leaving behind homes, businesses, entire lives. Refugee camps spring up along Highway 1. Disease spreads. Children are separated from parents. The elderly can't keep pace and collapse on roadsides. The humanitarian crisis is as devastating as the battle itself. On February 13th, General Creighton Abrams arrives at Hue. Abrams is a legend, World War II tank commander, the man who led the relief column to Bostonia during the Battle of the Bulge. He's been sent to assess the situation and take command if necessary. What Abrams sees shocks him. The Marines and South Vietnamese have been fighting for 2 weeks with inadequate reinforcements, limited air support, and no clear strategy beyond take the next block. Abrams recognizes the problem immediately. Frontal assault against fortified positions in urban terrain is a meat grinder. The casualty rate is unsustainable. Abrams orders a change in tactics. Instead of fighting building by building, concentrate firepower on the citadel walls. Use artillery, tank fire, and helicopter gunships to breach the walls, then exploit the breaches with infantry. Accept slower progress to minimize casualties. The old strategy, maximize enemy body count, is abandoned. The new strategy, preserve American lives, takes precedence. February 15th. American artillery begins systematically bombarding the citadel walls. The ancient fortress, which had survived centuries, crumbles under modern firepower. Sections of wall collapse. NVA soldiers retreat deeper into the citadel. The South Vietnamese forces, reinforced by Marine battalions, begin advancing through the breaches. The fighting is still brutal. Every room in every building has to be cleared, but the pace accelerates. The NVA, realizing they can't hold indefinitely, begin conducting a fighting withdrawal, bleeding the attackers while preparing to evacuate across the western gates toward the mountains. Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Cheatham, commanding 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, leads his men into the citadel on February 21st. Cheatham is 42 years old, a Korean War veteran. His Marines have been fighting continuously since January 31st, 3 weeks of combat without rest. They're exhausted, low on ammunition, down to half strength, but they keep advancing. Cheatham walks among his men, joking to keep morale up. "Just another day in paradise," he says, lighting a cigarette in a bombed-out building while NVA mortars explode a block away. His men think he's crazy, but they follow him. February 24th. The South Vietnamese flag is raised above the citadel walls, replacing the Viet Cong banner that had flown for 24 days. The NVA forces have withdrawn. The last organized resistance ends on March 2, 1968. The Battle of Hue is over. The casualty count is staggering. Approximately 1,600 American and South Vietnamese soldiers killed, 5,000 NVA killed, and between 2,000 and 5,000 civilians dead, many executed, others caught in crossfire or crushed under collapsing buildings. Hue, the ancient imperial capital, is a wasteland. The discovery of the mass graves begins in March 1968. South Vietnamese forces and American civil affairs teams start investigating reports from survivors about executions. They find bodies in schoolyards, pagodas, ditches, and shallow graves throughout the city. Hands tied behind backs, bullet wounds to the head. Some victims were buried alive, dirt in their lungs proves it. The communists had systematically executed South Vietnamese officials, police, military families, teachers, and anyone on their pre-prepared lists. The final death toll from these massacres, approximately 3,000 civilians. Some estimates go as high as 5,000. The exact number will never be known. Many bodies were never recovered. The executions were methodical. Communist political officers had lists of names. They conducted house-to-house searches. They arrested targets and marched them to execution sites. Some were shot. Others were clubbed to death to save ammunition. Some were buried alive in mass graves. This war crime receives minimal coverage in American media. The focus is on the battle itself, the military story of Marines fighting to retake the city. The massacre is mentioned in reports but doesn't dominate headlines. Why? Because by March 1968, American public opinion has already turned against the war. The Tet Offensive, of which Hugh was the most visible element, has convinced Americans that the war is unwinnable. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted journalist in America, traveled to Vietnam in February and concluded on national television that the war was a stalemate. President Lyndon Johnson, watching Cronkite's broadcast, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." 2 months later, Johnson announces he won't seek re-election. The Battle of Hue, therefore, achieves exactly what General Giap intended. Militarily, it's a catastrophic failure for the North Vietnamese. They lose 5,000 soldiers and gain no territory. But psychologically, it's a devastating victory. The fact that the enemy could capture a major city, hold it for a month, and force a grinding urban battle proves that 3 years of American bombing and search and destroy operations have not broken the enemy's will. The American public sees the ruins of Hue on television and concludes the war is lost. Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham survives the battle and later writes, "We won every engagement, we took the city back, but it felt like defeat because the strategy was wrong. We were fighting to hold cities while the enemy was fighting to break our will. They succeeded." Lance Corporal Tom survives too. He returns to Kansas in 1969. He doesn't talk about Hue for 30 years. When he finally does in a 1999 interview, he says, "The worst part wasn't the fighting, it was the civilians, families caught in the crossfire, children screaming, old people who couldn't run. We were trying to save the city and we destroyed it. That's the paradox nobody talks about." The refugees from Hue, over 100,000 people, many never return. Some settle in Saigon. Others make their way to refugee camps. Some eventually emigrate to the United States after the war ends. The psychological trauma of displacement lasts generations. Families are fractured. Children grow up without homes. The city of Hue is rebuilt over decades, but the ancient structures destroyed in 33 days of fighting can never be fully restored. The citadel itself becomes a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1993. Tourists visit the restored walls and palaces. They take photographs. They don't see the bullet holes that were patched over or the mass graves that were exhumed and reburied. They don't hear the echoes of Marines clearing rooms or the screams of civilians executed for being on the wrong list. History sanitizes. Memory fades. But the veterans remember. Sergeant Alfredo Gonzalez, who died saving his squad on February 4th, is buried in his hometown of Edinburgh, Texas. His family receives his Medal of Honor in a ceremony in 1969. His mother keeps his photo on the mantle for the rest of her life. She never stops asking, what was the point? Why did he die fighting for a city that America abandoned 6 years later? March 2, 1968. The last NVA soldier withdraws from Hue. The battle is over. The city is secured. The South Vietnamese government reclaims the citadel. American commanders declare victory. Body counts are reported. 5,000 enemy killed versus 1,600 friendly casualties, a favorable ratio. The metrics look good. But metrics don't capture truth. The Battle of Hue was a tactical victory that became a strategic defeat. The Americans and South Vietnamese won the city and lost the war. The 33 days of fighting demonstrated that urban warfare negates American technological advantages. Helicopters can't maneuver between buildings. Artillery kills civilians. Airstrikes destroy the city you're trying to save. The only way to clear a city is to send infantry room by room, accepting casualties, grinding forward against an enemy that can hide anywhere. General Abrams understands this. After Hugh, he changes American strategy in Vietnam. The focus shifts from body count to population security, from search and destroy to clear and hold. But the change comes too late. American public opinion has turned. The anti-war movement grows larger. Universities erupt in protests. Draft dodging increases. The 1968 Democratic National Convention descends into riots. Senator Robert Kennedy, running for president on an anti-war platform, wins the California primary before being assassinated in June 1968. The country is fracturing. The Battle of Hue exposed the fundamental contradiction of the Vietnam War. You can win every battle and still lose the war if the political objective is unclear and public support collapses. The Marines who fought in Hue performed with extraordinary courage and skill. They cleared the city building by building, took horrific casualties, and accomplished their mission. But their victory didn't matter. The images of devastated Hue broadcast on American television convinced millions that the war was unwinnable. The North Vietnamese learned the opposite lesson. They learned that military defeat could translate into political victory if the battle was visible enough and shocking enough. Giap's gamble worked. The Tet Offensive failed militarily but succeeded strategically. The Battle of Hue was the most visible element of that offensive. The longest battle, the most dramatic images, the clearest evidence that the enemy was still capable of massing forces and fighting conventional battles despite 3 years of American efforts to destroy them. Hue also demonstrated the brutal reality of urban warfare, something American military planners would forget and relearn decades later in Fallujah, Mosul, and Ramadi. Cities are different battlefields. Technology doesn't dominate. Air power is constrained. Artillery is a blunt instrument. Infantry carries the burden. Casualties mount. Progress is slow. And the political cost of destroying a city to save it can exceed the military value of victory. For the Marines who fought there, Hue remains a defining experience. They remember the narrow streets, the constant sniper fire, the crash of buildings collapsing, the smell of cordite and death. They remember their friends who didn't come home. They remember the civilians caught in the crossfire. They remember advancing block by block, room by room, knowing that every door might conceal an enemy. And they remember the moment when they raised the American flag above the MACV compound and the South Vietnamese flag above the citadel, symbols of victory that felt hollow because the cost was so high. The lesson of Hue is not that urban warfare is impossible. It's that urban warfare requires a different calculus. Military commanders must accept slower progress, higher casualties, and political constraints. They must balance the military objective of destroying the enemy with the political objective of minimizing civilian suffering. They must understand that winning the battle might mean losing the war if the images of destruction undermine public support. American military doctrine evolved after Hue. Urban warfare training became standard. Tactics for clearing buildings and minimizing collateral damage were developed. Rules of engagement were refined. But the fundamental lesson, that firepower alone cannot win urban battles, took decades to fully absorb. The Marines who fought in Hue learned it in blood. The rest of the military learned it through their sacrifice. Today, the citadel of Hue stands restored. The bullet-scarred walls have been patched. The Imperial Palace has been rebuilt. Tourists walk the same streets where Marines and NVA soldiers fought and died. The mass graves have been marked. Memorials honor the dead, Vietnamese and American. The city has moved on, but the veterans haven't. They carry Hue with them forever. Lance Corporal Robert Toms, who survived that first night when the rockets hit MACV, returned to the United States in 1969. He worked construction for 40 years. He raised 3 kids. He never talked about Hue except to other veterans. When he died in 2015, his family found boxes of letters he'd written from Vietnam but never sent. The letters described the fear, the exhaustion, the guilt of surviving when so many didn't. The last letter, dated March 3, 1968, one day after the battle ended, said simply, "We won, but it doesn't feel like victory. It just feels like we survived." If this story made you understand the real cost of war, not the glory, not the heroism, but the grinding brutality and the human toll, share it. The Marines who fought at Hue deserve to be remembered for what they endured. So do the 3,000 civilians executed in mass graves. So do the 100,000 refugees who lost everything. January 30th, 1968, 2:47 a.m. U.S. Embassy Compound, Saigon, South Vietnam. Specialist Charles Daniel, 22 years old from Ohio, stands guard duty at the main gate. The night smells like diesel exhaust mixed with street vendor food from earlier celebrations. Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, the biggest holiday of the year. A ceasefire is supposed to be in effect. Both sides agreed to pause fighting for the holiday. Daniel's been in country for 9 months. This is supposed to be the quiet shift. He leans against the guard post, fighting sleep. The air is thick, humid, 85 degrees even at this hour. Mosquitoes buzz around the floodlights. Then he hears it, the crack of an explosion 2 blocks away. Then another. Then the distinctive rattle of AK-47 automatic fire, slower rate than M16's deeper sound. Daniel grabs his M16 and peers into the darkness. Figures moving in the street. Running, not civilians. Soldiers wearing black pajamas and carrying weapons. 19 Viet Cong sappers are sprinting toward the embassy wall carrying satchel charges and AK-47s. They're attacking the most secure American facility in Vietnam, the symbol of American power in Southeast Asia. What happens in the next 6 hours will change the war forever. Not because the attack succeeds. It doesn't. Every attacker will be killed. But because 30 million Americans will watch footage of enemy soldiers breaching the embassy wall on the evening news. They'll watch American MPs fighting desperately to hold the compound. They'll see the smoke and blood and chaos. And they'll ask the question that will end American involvement in Vietnam. If we're winning this war, how are enemy soldiers attacking our embassy? By the end of this story, you'll understand how America won every battle during the Tet Offensive and lost the war anyway. You'll see how 45,000 dead enemy soldiers translated into political victory for North Vietnam. You'll witness the moment when military success became strategic failure. If you're here for the hard truths about war, not the propaganda version, hit that like button and let's watch America's confidence shatter in real time. 6 months earlier, Hanoi, North Vietnam. October 1967. Senior General Vo Nguyen Giap, 56 years old, sits at a conference table with the Politburo, the ruling council of North Vietnam. Maps cover the walls. Intelligence reports stack 3 feet high. The room smells like cigarette smoke and strong Vietnamese coffee. Outside the windows, Hanoi shows scars from 3 years of American bombing. Empty lots where buildings used to stand, makeshift repairs on damaged structures. The question on the table is desperate. How do you defeat an enemy with unlimited resources, overwhelming technology, and 500,000 soldiers committed to your destruction? The American bombing campaign has devastated North Vietnam's infrastructure. 3 years of search and destroy operations have killed tens of thousands of communist soldiers. American military commanders are claiming victory is near. General William Westmoreland tells reporters the enemy is on the ropes. American public opinion, while beginning to fracture, still generally supports the war. Giap's answer is audacious and insane. Attack everywhere simultaneously during Tet, the Lunar New Year holiday when both sides traditionally observe a ceasefire. Strike over 100 cities, towns, and military installations across South Vietnam in coordinated assaults. The objective isn't to hold territory. The objective is psychological shock. If North Vietnam can demonstrate it's still capable of massing tens of thousands of soldiers and conducting coordinated nationwide attacks despite 3 years of American bombing, American public opinion will collapse. Americans will conclude the war is unwinnable. The cost in communist casualties will be catastrophic. Estimates run as high as 50,000 or 60,000 killed and wounded. But these losses are acceptable if the political objective is achieved. Break American will. Force negotiations. Win through politics what can't be won through military force. Ho Chi Minh, 77 years old, dying of tuberculosis but still the spiritual leader of North Vietnam, listens to Giap's plan. His hands tremble slightly as he lights a cigarette. He asks the question that matters. Can our people accept these casualties? The room goes quiet. Everyone knows what he's really asking. Are we willing to spend tens of thousands of lives on a gamble that might fail? Giap's answer is blunt. We have no choice. America will not leave unless they believe the cost is too high. We must show them the cost is infinite. The Politburo votes. The offensive is approved. Planning begins immediately. For 3 months, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units infiltrate soldiers into South Vietnamese cities. It's meticulous work. Weapons are smuggled in rice shipments, hidden in false-bottomed carts, carried piece by sympathizers. Ammunition is cached in homes and businesses. Communist sympathizers provide safe houses. Soldiers arrive individually or in small groups, never large enough to attract attention. Attack plans are detailed, specific objectives for each unit, precise timing down to the minute, withdrawal routes mapped, ammunition estimates calculated. The scale is unprecedented. Approximately 85,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas will participate in the initial attacks. American intelligence picks up fragments of the planning through captured documents and interrogations. Prisoners mention a major offensive during Tet. Documents reference coordinated attacks. Radio intercepts show increased enemy communications. But nobody in American command believes the enemy is capable of coordinated nationwide attacks. The prevailing wisdom says the communists are too weak, too degraded by 3 years of losses. CIA analysts write reports warning of large-scale attacks, but field commanders dismiss them. Westmoreland issues a statement on January 17th. I do not believe the enemy has the capability for a major offensive. Tet will be quiet, he says. The ceasefire will hold. Americans can relax. January 30th, 1968. Midnight. The ceasefire expires, and hell comes to South Vietnam. 2:47 a.m. Saigon. The U.S. Embassy attack begins. 19 Viet Cong sappers blow a hole in the embassy wall with C4 explosives. The blast echoes across downtown Saigon like thunder. Windows shatter 3 blocks away. Specialist Daniel opens fire from the guard post. His M16 hammers on full automatic, 30 rounds in 3 seconds. Brass casings rain onto concrete. Tracers light up the courtyard like red fireflies. The sappers return fire and charge through the hole in the wall. American MPs pour out of the embassy building wearing flak jackets hastily thrown over t-shirts and boxer shorts. The firefight is close quarters, distances measured in feet, not yards. Grenades explode with sharp cracks. Ricochets ping off concrete and wind through the air. Smoke fills the courtyard, stinging eyes, making it hard to breathe. The sappers fight with desperate courage. They know this is a suicide mission. Their job is to penetrate the embassy building and hold it long enough for international media to photograph the Viet Cong flag flying above the symbol of American power. They get close. 3 sappers reach the embassy building's front door, 20 feet from success, before being cut down by MP fire. The rest die in the courtyard or trying to retreat through the wall breach. The firefight lasts 6 hours. Dawn breaks over Saigon with smoke still drifting across the compound. By 9:00 a.m., all 19 attackers are dead. Their bodies lie scattered in the courtyard, weapons still clutched in hands. 3 American MPs are killed. 5 more are wounded. The embassy building itself is never breached, American security held. The massive wooden doors show bullet impacts but didn't give way. But the images broadcast around the world show bullet holes in the embassy wall, dead bodies in the courtyard, American soldiers fighting desperately at close range, blood on the marble steps. The psychological impact is devastating. Americans watching the evening news see their embassy, supposedly the most secure facility in Vietnam, under attack by enemy soldiers. If the embassy can be attacked, nowhere is safe. If the enemy can mass forces for coordinated assaults on major cities, they're not on the ropes. They're fighting harder than ever. But Saigon is just one attack point. Across South Vietnam, 100 other locations come under simultaneous assault. In Hue, as covered in our previous episode, 12,000 North Vietnamese army soldiers attack from 4 directions and capture most of the ancient imperial capital within 6 hours. The battle to retake Hue will last 33 days and destroy 80% of the city. In the Central Highlands, North Vietnamese forces surround the Marine combat base at Khe Sanh, initiating a 77-day siege that will dominate American news coverage for months and create comparisons to Dien Bien Phu, the French defeat that ended French colonial rule in 1954. In cities and provincial capitals across the Mekong Delta, Viet Cong units attack government buildings, police stations, radio transmitters. Some attacks are company-sized operations with hundreds of soldiers. Others are smaller unit actions, just 10 or 15 men hitting specific targets. But the overall effect is synchronized nationwide assault, exactly what American intelligence said was impossible. The American military response is immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, American and South Vietnamese forces begin counterattacking. B-52 bombers pound suspected enemy positions with 500-pound bombs. Each bomber carries 108 bombs, 60,000 pounds of high explosives. Artillery fires tens of thousands of rounds, the sound continuous, rolling like thunder. Helicopter gunships strafe enemy formations with miniguns that fire 4,000 rounds per minute. Reinforcements rush to threaten locations, Marines, Army infantry, airborne units. The fighting is brutal and costly, but American firepower dominates. Within days, it becomes clear that the offensive is militarily failing. The enemy is suffering catastrophic casualties. No major cities are being held. The general uprising of South Vietnamese civilians that the communists hoped would occur doesn't materialize. The South Vietnamese government and army don't collapse. They fight back harder than the communists anticipated. February 5th. General William Westmoreland holds a press conference in Saigon. The cameras are rolling. Reporters crowd the briefing room. Westmoreland stands at the podium in his pressed uniform, 4 stars gleaming on his collar, confident, smiling. He announces that the Tet Offensive has been decisively defeated. Enemy casualties are estimated at 45,000 killed and wounded. American and South Vietnamese casualties are approximately 3,400 combined. The casualty ratio, approximately 15-1 in favor of the Allies, proves that American strategy is working. The enemy threw his best forces at American positions and was crushed. Westmoreland declares, "The enemy has been defeated at every turn. This offensive has been a complete failure for them." He fields questions from reporters. One asks, if the enemy is so weak, how did they attack 100 locations simultaneously? Westmoreland's answer is confident. They gambled everything and lost. They will not recover from these losses. But 9,000 miles away, in American living rooms, the images tell a different story. Walter Cronkite, 51 years old, the most trusted journalist in America, sits in his CBS News office in New York watching footage from Vietnam. Cronkite anchors the CBS Evening News. 30 million Americans watch his broadcast every night. He's not a war critic. He's a mainstream journalist who has generally supported American military reporting. But what he's seeing from Vietnam shocks him. The scale of the offensive. The fact that enemy forces attacked the U.S. Embassy. The ruins of Hue broadcast on television. Entire city blocks reduced to rubble. The siege at Khe Sanh creating daily headlines about Marines surrounded, potentially facing another Dien Bien Phu. None of this matches what Westmoreland has been saying for months. Westmoreland claimed the enemy was being systematically degraded. He said American strategy was working. He said the end was in sight, that maybe another year of sustained effort would produce victory. But if the enemy is so weak, how can they launch nationwide coordinated attacks on this scale? Cronkite makes a decision. He's going to Vietnam to see for himself. February 11th, Cronkite lands in Saigon. The humidity hits him like a wall as he steps off the plane. He spends 2 weeks interviewing soldiers, visiting battle sites, talking to commanders. What he finds contradicts everything Westmoreland has been saying. The soldiers tell Cronkite they're fighting an enemy that shows no signs of breaking. They describe battles where they killed dozens of enemy soldiers only to face fresh attacks the next day. The destroyed cities demonstrate that American firepower, while devastating, can't prevent enemy attacks. The casualty figures, while favorable to the Americans, don't seem to matter. The enemy keeps coming, keeps fighting, keeps dying, and keeps being replaced. Cronkite realizes he's been misled. The war is not winding down. It's not nearing victory. It's a stalemate. And stalemates in wars 9,000 miles from home don't end in victory. They end in withdrawal. February 27, 1968. Cronkite returns to New York and delivers his evening news editorial. 30 million Americans are watching. Cronkite looks directly into the camera, his face grave, and says words that will change history. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems only realistic. It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate. Not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. President Lyndon Johnson is watching in the White House residence. When Cronkite finishes, Johnson turns to an aide and says, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He walks to the window and stares out at the Washington Monument, silent for several minutes. If stories like this, where the truth destroys the narrative, are what you're here for, tap that like button. This is where America's confidence in the war died in real time. The political earthquake is immediate. Cronkite represents mainstream American opinion, not radical anti-war activists but middle-class patriotic Americans who trust his judgment. If Cronkite says the war is unwinnable, millions of Americans will reach the same conclusion. The anti-war movement, which had been growing but remained a minority position, suddenly becomes mainstream. College campuses erupt in protests. Students occupy administration buildings. Major newspapers, including the New York Times and Washington Post, begin calling for negotiations and withdrawal. Influential politicians start questioning whether the war can be won at any acceptable cost. Senator Eugene McCarthy, running for president on an anti-war platform, nearly defeats Johnson in the New Hampshire Democratic primary on March 12th. McCarthy wins 42% of the vote, shocking everyone. Johnson, the sitting president with all the advantages of incumbency, barely holds New Hampshire with 49%. 4 days later, Senator Robert Kennedy announces he's running for president on an anti-war platform. The Democratic Party is fracturing. The 1968 presidential election is becoming a referendum on the war. March 31st, 1968. President Johnson addresses the nation on television. He looks tired, dark circles under his eyes. His approval rating has collapsed to 36%, the lowest of his presidency. He announces a partial bombing halt of North Vietnam. No strikes north of the 20th parallel. He offers to begin peace negotiations with Hanoi without preconditions. Then, at the end of the speech, he drops the bombshell. "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." Johnson is withdrawing from the 1968 presidential race. The Tet Offensive, militarily a catastrophic defeat for North Vietnam, has broken the American president's will to continue. The political objective of the offensive has been achieved. But the military story is equally important. Because while the Tet Offensive was politically devastating for America, it was militarily catastrophic for the Viet Cong. The casualty figures tell the story. Approximately 45,000 to 60,000 communist soldiers were killed or wounded during the offensive. Some estimates go higher. The Viet Cong, in particular, took devastating losses. The VC had been the primary communist force in South Vietnam for years, relying on guerrilla tactics and local support. The Tet Offensive required the VC to abandon guerrilla warfare and fight conventional battles in urban terrain against superior American firepower. They were slaughtered. In many provinces, the Viet Cong as an organized fighting force ceased to exist. Entire VC battalions were wiped out. From 1968 forward, the North Vietnamese Army, not the Viet Cong, would bear the primary burden of the war in the South. Lieutenant Colonel Du Quien, commanding a Viet Cong battalion that attacked Ben Tre in the Mekong Delta, survives the offensive and later writes in his memoir, "We accomplished nothing militarily. We captured no cities. We held no ground. My battalion lost 400 men out of 600. I watched my best fighters die in street fighting against American helicopters and tanks." But weeks later, when I saw American television footage showing their public turning against the war, I understood. We lost the battle and won the war. This is the paradox of Tet. Military victory and political victory operated on different planes. The Americans won every tactical engagement. They inflicted catastrophic casualties on the enemy. They held all major positions. American soldiers performed with extraordinary courage and skill. But the images broadcast on American television, enemy soldiers attacking the embassy, cities under siege, American forces taking casualties in street fighting, convinced the American public that the war was unwinnable, that 3 years of effort had accomplished nothing, that the enemy remained as strong as ever. General Westmoreland never understood this. After Tet, he requested 206,000 additional troops to exploit the enemy's weakened position. He genuinely believed the offensive had been a strategic opportunity. The enemy had exposed himself to American firepower and been decimated. With additional forces, Westmoreland argued, the crossover point could be reached, the moment when enemy casualties exceed replacement capacity, forcing surrender. Give him more soldiers, and he could end the war within a year. But the request was leaked to the New York Times. Americans read that despite 3 years of war, despite 500,000 troops already in Vietnam, despite constant claims that victory was near, the general wanted 206,000 more soldiers. The request seemed to prove that the war had no end, that no amount of troops would be enough, that the military was chasing an impossible objective. The request was denied. Westmoreland was reassigned, promoted to Army Chief of Staff, which looked like advancement but removed him from combat command. His replacement was General Creighton Abrams, a World War II tank commander with a different strategic vision. Abrams recognized that the war could not be won militarily at acceptable political cost. American public opinion had turned. The strategy had to change. Abrams implemented Vietnamization, gradually transferring combat responsibility from American forces to South Vietnamese forces while American troops withdrew. The objective was no longer victory, but managed decline. Preserve South Vietnamese independence long enough for American forces to leave without the war being completely lost. It was an admission of strategic failure disguised as policy adjustment. This strategic shift represented a complete reversal. The body count metrics that had defined success for 3 years were abandoned. The search and destroy operations that had consumed resources were de-emphasized. The focus shifted to territorial control and population security, the things that should have mattered from the beginning. But the fundamental problem remained. South Vietnam, without massive American support, was unlikely to survive against a North Vietnamese enemy absolutely committed to conquest. The Tet Offensive achieved exactly what General Giap intended. It didn't win the war militarily, but it broke American political will. It forced a strategic shift from victory to withdrawal. It demonstrated that wars are won not by casualty ratios, but by political resolve. The side willing to accept higher costs and maintain commitment longer wins, regardless of battlefield outcomes. For the 19 Viet Cong sappers who attacked the U.S. Embassy on January 30th, their deaths accomplished the mission. They never breached the embassy building. They inflicted minimal American casualties. Their attack lasted 6 hours and ended in complete tactical failure. But their attack, broadcast on television around the world, convinced millions of Americans that the war was unwinnable. Their sacrifice, militarily pointless, was politically decisive. Specialist Charles Daniel, who survived the embassy attack, returned to Ohio in 1969. He worked in a factory for 40 years, married, raised 3 kids, never talked about Vietnam except to other veterans. When he died in 2011, his family found a journal he'd kept. The entry for January 30th, 1968 said simply, "We killed them all, everyone. We held the embassy. Not a single enemy soldier got inside." But watching the news tonight, seeing what they're showing America, I understood. We won the battle, but the images lost us the war. How do you fight images? The Tet Offensive killed 45,000 enemy soldiers. It broke one American president's will to govern. It shifted American strategy from victory to withdrawal. It proved that television images can matter more than battlefield outcomes. It demonstrated that political will, not military power, determines who wins wars. And it set in motion the events that would lead to American withdrawal in 1973 and communist victory in 1975. We won every battle. Then we lost the war. That's the lesson of Tet. Military success without political strategy is defeat. Firepower without public support is wasted. Technology without clear objectives achieves nothing. The Tet Offensive proved it. America learned it too late. 58,000 American soldiers would die for objectives that had already been lost the moment Cronkite said the war was unwinnable. If this story made you see the Vietnam War differently, not as a military failure but as a political catastrophe, share it. The soldiers who fought during Tet deserve to be remembered for their courage. So does the truth about why their sacrifice didn't matter. March 2, 1965. Zom Bang Ammunition Depot, North Vietnam. 7:15 a.m. The sky above the jungle fills with the roar of 104 American aircraft. F-105 Thunder Chiefs, B-57 Canberras, F-100 Super Sabres, flying in tight formation toward a target the size of 3 football fields. Major James Kassler, 38 years old, leading a flight of 4 F-105s, watches the target coordinates appear on his heads-up display. He's been briefed that this is a surgical strike. Destroy the ammunition depot, send a message to Hanoi, go home. Clean, simple, effective. What Kassler doesn't know, what none of the pilots circling above North Vietnam that morning know, is that they're launching the longest and most futile bombing campaign in American military history. For the next 3 years, 7 months and 31 days, American aircraft will drop more bombs on North Vietnam than the Allies dropped on Nazi Germany in all of World War II. They'll destroy 85% of petroleum storage, obliterate 70% of power generation, kill tens of thousands of people, lose nearly 1,000 aircraft, and achieve absolutely nothing. The target is below, Kassler rolls in, the bombs fall. Then the sky explodes with anti-aircraft fire. 6 American aircraft are shot down in the first mission. Welcome to Operation Rolling Thunder, the war North Vietnam won without surrendering. By the end of this story, you'll understand how America dropped 850,000 tons of bombs and changed nothing. You'll see how technology became a substitute for strategy. You'll witness the moment American leadership decided that destruction equals victory, and how that delusion cost 58,000 American lives and accomplished 0 political objectives. This isn't about tactics. This is about the catastrophic gap between military power and strategic understanding. If you're tired of history that sugarcoats failure, hit that like button, and let's examine the bombing campaign that proved firepower can't win wars. 6 months earlier, in Washington, D.C., President Lyndon Johnson sits in the Oval Office with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The question on the table is simple. How do you stop North Vietnam from supplying the communist insurgency in South Vietnam without invading North Vietnam and risking Chinese or Soviet intervention? McNamara, a former Ford Motor Company executive who believes war can be managed like a business, has an answer: graduated pressure. Bomb North Vietnam systematically. Start with military targets. Escalate slowly. Increase the pain until Ho Chi Minh realizes the cost of continuing the war exceeds the benefits. Force him to negotiate. Win without ground invasion. The logic seems sound. World War II proved that bombing could devastate industrial capacity. The problem was that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were industrial powers. They needed factories, transportation networks, oil refineries to wage war. Destroy those things, and you cripple their ability to fight. North Vietnam in 1965 is not an industrial power. It's an agrarian society with a small industrial base, most of it concentrated near Hanoi and Haiphong. Its soldiers in the south carry rifles, grenades, and ammunition, simple weapons that can be manufactured anywhere or imported from China and the Soviet Union. North Vietnam doesn't need a massive industrial base to wage war. It needs only enough supplies to keep soldiers fed and armed. That's a fundamentally different logistics problem than the one faced by Nazi Germany. But McNamara and Johnson believe the theory. They approve Operation Rolling Thunder. The name itself is telling: rolling, gradual, sustained. Not a knockout punch, but a slow strangulation. The campaign begins with explicit constraints. No bombing within 30 miles of Hanoi or 10 miles of Haiphong. No strikes on dikes or dams that could flood cities and kill massive civilian populations. No attacks on airfields where Soviet personnel might be stationed. No bombing of Chinese border areas. The targets are pre-approved by Washington. Johnson himself signs off on bombing runs. The constraints reflect fear of escalation. If American bombs kill Soviet advisors, Moscow might intervene. If Chinese territory is violated, Beijing might send troops like they did in Korea. So the bombing is limited, controlled, calibrated. March 2, 1965. The first mission. 104 aircraft strike Zombang. 6 planes are shot down. The Americans are shocked. Intelligence had reported minimal air defenses. Intelligence was wrong. North Vietnam has SA-2 surface-to-air missiles supplied by the Soviet Union, sophisticated radar-guided weapons that can reach altitudes of 60,000 feet. The North Vietnamese also have MiG-17 fighter jets, older Soviet designs but fast and maneuverable. The American pilots, flying heavily loaded strike aircraft, are vulnerable. The F-105 Thunderchief, the primary bomber used in Rolling Thunder, is a massive single-seat fighter bomber designed to deliver nuclear weapons at supersonic speeds. It's fast in a straight line but terrible at turning. Loaded with bombs and flying low to avoid radar, F-105s are easy targets for anti-aircraft artillery and MiG attacks. Pilots call the F-105 Thud, short for Thunderchief, but also a dark reference to the sound it makes when it hits the ground. The campaign escalates. By June 1965, American aircraft are flying 3,000 sorties per month. Targets expand from ammunition depots to bridges, roads, rail lines, barracks, radar sites. The objective is interdiction, cut off North Vietnam's ability to move supplies south. The problem is that North Vietnamese supply lines don't run through North Vietnam. They run through Laos and Cambodia along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of roads, paths, rivers, and jungle routes that American aircraft are forbidden to bomb because Laos and Cambodia are officially neutral. So American planes destroy bridges in North Vietnam while supplies flow untouched through Laos. July 1965. The campaign enters Phase II. More targets, more sorties, more restrictions. American pilots are given specific routes to fly, ingress routes and egress routes that are predictable and repetitive. The North Vietnamese quickly learn these routes and position anti-aircraft guns along them. The result is devastating. American aircraft fly into walls of flak, exploding shells filling the sky with shrapnel. Pilots describe it as flying through thunderstorms made of steel. Loss rates climb. By the end of 1965, over 100 American aircraft have been shot down. Captain James Stockdale, a Navy pilot flying A-4 Skyhawks off the carrier USS Oriskany, completes his 50th mission over North Vietnam in September 1965. He'll fly 150 more missions before being shot down in September 1965 and spending 7.5 years as a prisoner of war. Stockdale later writes that he knew by his 30th mission that the bombing campaign was strategically pointless. He could see the results: destroyed bridges rebuilt within days, bombed roads repaired overnight, supplies continuing to flow. But orders were orders, so he flew. January 1966. Phase III begins. The focus shifts to petroleum, oil, and lubricant targets, POL in military jargon. The theory is that without fuel, North Vietnam's trucks and aircraft can't operate. The Air Force requests permission to strike major POL storage facilities near Hanoi and Haiphong. Johnson hesitates. These targets are close to civilian areas. McNamara argues the strikes are essential. Johnson approves. June 29, 1966. American aircraft strike oil storage tanks at Hanoi and Haiphong. The attacks are devastating. Massive fireballs visible for miles. CIA analysts estimate that 70% of North Vietnam's oil storage capacity is destroyed. It looks like success. It isn't. Within weeks, CIA reports reveal that North Vietnam had anticipated the strikes and dispersed most of its oil stocks into 50-gallon drums hidden throughout the countryside. The big storage tanks were largely empty. The impressive explosions destroyed infrastructure but not fuel supplies. North Vietnam adapts. Instead of centralizing supplies in vulnerable depots, they distribute everything. Ammunition is stored in thousands of small caches. Fuel is kept in drums scattered across villages. Food is dispersed. This makes logistics more difficult but also makes the supply system nearly invulnerable to bombing. You can't destroy what you can't find. And you can't find 10,000 supply caches hidden in jungle and farmland. The North Vietnamese air defense system evolves. By late 1966, North Vietnam operates over 200 SA-2 missile sites. The missiles are mobile. They can be moved overnight to avoid strikes. American pilots develop countermeasures, flying low to avoid radar, using electronic jamming, launching Wild Weasel missions specifically to destroy SAM sites. But the North Vietnamese keep adding missiles. The Soviet Union and China pour military aid into North Vietnam, an estimated $1 billion per year. Every weapon destroyed is replaced. Every bridge bombed is rebuilt or bypassed. The Americans are trying to drain a bathtub while the faucet runs at full blast. October 1966. Phase IV begins. The target list expands to include power plants and industrial facilities. For the first time, American aircraft strike targets inside Hanoi city limits. The restrictions that previously protected the capital are relaxed. The bombing becomes heavier, more destructive, more indiscriminate. Civilian casualties mount. North Vietnamese propaganda uses the bombing to rally popular support. The Americans are bombing hospitals, schools, residential neighborhoods. Some of this propaganda is true. Precision bombing in 1966 means hitting within 100 meters of the target. In dense urban areas, 100-meter accuracy still kills civilians. December 13, 1966. American aircraft strike the Yen Vien Railway Yard on the outskirts of Hanoi. The attack destroys locomotives, rail cars, repair facilities. It also kills an estimated 100 civilians living near the rail yard. International outrage follows. The Soviet Union condemns the attacks. China threatens intervention. Johnson orders a bombing pause, a temporary cessation of strikes, hoping it will lead to negotiations. North Vietnam refuses. The pause lasts 37 days. During the pause, North Vietnam repairs damaged infrastructure, moves supplies south, and prepares for the resumption of bombing. When Rolling Thunder resumes in February 1967, the North Vietnamese are stronger than before the pause. May 1967. Phase V begins. The gloves are off. American aircraft are authorized to strike virtually any military or industrial target in North Vietnam except within a 10-mile exclusion zone around Hanoi and a 4-mile zone around Haiphong. The bombing becomes a daily routine. Wake up, brief, fly, bomb, evade missiles, return, debrief, repeat. Pilots complete 100 missions, 200 missions. Some pilots fly over 300 missions. The psychological toll is immense. Every mission is a roll of the dice. Surface-to-air missiles, MiG fighters, anti-aircraft artillery, any one of them can kill you. Pilots develop superstitions, rituals, fatalism. Some refuse to learn the names of new pilots until they've survived 50 missions. Statistically, that's when survival odds improve. October 26, 1967. Commander John McCain, flying his 23rd bombing mission, rolls in on a target near Hanoi. His A-4 Skyhawk is hit by an SA-2 missile. The explosion tears off the right wing. McCain ejects. Both arms break during the ejection. His right leg shatters. He parachutes into Truc Bac Lake in central Hanoi. North Vietnamese soldiers pull him from the water and beat him. McCain is taken to Ho Lo prison, the Hanoi Hilton, where he'll spend 5.5 years being tortured. He survives. Over 200 other American pilots shot down during Rolling Thunder are not as fortunate. Some are killed during shootdown. Others die in captivity. The rest endure years of torture, starvation, and solitary confinement. The human cost is staggering. Nearly 1,000 American aircraft lost. Over 800 aircrew killed, missing, or captured. Tens of thousands of North Vietnamese civilians killed. The exact number will never be known. Estimates range from 50,000 to 150,000 dead. Millions displaced. Cities scarred. Infrastructure destroyed. And for what? By late 1967, CIA intelligence assessments conclude that losses have not meaningfully degraded North Vietnam's ability to continue war. The bombing has destroyed buildings and killed people, but it has not achieved any political objective. North Vietnam has not stopped supporting the Viet Cong. It has not sued for peace. It has not reduced its commitment to conquering South Vietnam. Why? Because the fundamental premise of Rolling Thunder is wrong. The campaign assumes that North Vietnam values economic development and material comfort more than it values ideological conquest. It assumes that suffering will break will. It assumes that Ho Chi Minh and the Politburo will calculate costs and benefits rationally and choose surrender over destruction. These assumptions are false. North Vietnamese leadership values reunification of Vietnam under communist rule above all else. They're willing to accept any level of destruction, any number of casualties, any amount of suffering to achieve that goal. The bombing campaign, rather than weakening their resolve, strengthens it. Every bomb dropped becomes evidence of American imperialism. Every civilian killed becomes a martyr. Every destroyed building becomes proof that the government must resist. The North Vietnamese also learn tactical lessons that negate American advantages. They discover that American aircraft follow predictable patterns, same routes, same altitudes, same times of day. So they position anti-aircraft guns along those routes. They learn to move supplies at night when bombing is less accurate. They learn to rebuild bridges quickly using prefabricated materials. They learn to disperse everything so that no single strike achieves strategic effect. The Americans destroy a bridge. The North Vietnamese install a pontoon bridge 500 meters away and repair the original bridge within 3 days. The Americans bomb a rail line. The North Vietnamese reroute trains. The Americans destroy a power plant. The North Vietnamese import generators from China. The strategic failure becomes undeniable after the Tet Offensive in January 1968. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launch coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, including an assault on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The attacks are militarily defeated. The enemy suffers massive casualties and gains no territory. But the psychological impact is devastating. The American public, told for 3 years that the bombing campaign is crippling North Vietnam and that victory is near, watches on television as enemy forces attack the capital of South Vietnam. The credibility gap becomes a chasm. If 3 years of bombing have crippled North Vietnam, how can they launch nationwide offensives? March 31, 1968. President Johnson addresses the nation. He announces a partial bombing halt. All strikes north of the 20th parallel are suspended. He announces he will not seek re-election. The bombing campaign has failed. Johnson knows it. McNamara, who resigned as Defense Secretary in February 1968, knows it. The pilots flying the missions know it. The only people who don't seem to know it are the Air Force generals, who continue to argue that the campaign would have worked if only political restrictions had been lifted. This argument is almost certainly false. The problem with Rolling Thunder was never insufficient bombing. It was that bombing, by itself, cannot achieve political objectives against a determined enemy with external support and superior strategic patience. The campaign officially ends on November 1, 1968. President Johnson announces a complete bombing halt in hopes of facilitating peace negotiations. The negotiations begin but go nowhere. North Vietnam negotiates on its own timeline, not America's. It takes 5 more years. 5 more years of war, 5 more years of casualties, 5 more years of strategic drift, before the Paris Peace Accords are signed in January 1973. Those accords do not end the war. They only end American involvement. North Vietnam invades South Vietnam in 1975 and conquers it completely. Saigon falls. The war ends in total North Vietnamese victory. Operation Rolling Thunder dropped 850,000 tons of bombs and accomplished none of its objectives. It did not force North Vietnam to stop supporting the Viet Cong. It did not cripple North Vietnam's ability to wage war. It did not bring North Vietnam to the negotiating table from a position of weakness. It did not boost South Vietnamese morale. It did not prevent the flow of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The campaign destroyed infrastructure, killed civilians, lost aircraft, captured pilots, and achieved nothing. The tragedy of Rolling Thunder is not that it was poorly executed. American pilots flew with extraordinary skill and courage. The tragedy is that it was strategically flawed from conception. Bombing cannot extract political concessions from an enemy with superior will. Firepower cannot substitute for strategy. Technology cannot overcome political determination. These are lessons that should have been learned from Rolling Thunder. Instead, they were rationalized away. The Air Force argued that political constraints prevented victory, but the constraints were not the problem. The problem was the belief that bombing alone could win a war. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson Rissner, an Air Force pilot shot down in 1965, spends 7 years in North Vietnamese prisons. He's tortured repeatedly. He survives and is released in 1973. Rissner later writes, "We flew the missions we were ordered to fly. We bombed the targets we were told to bomb. We did our duty, but the strategy was wrong. You can't bomb an enemy into submission if that enemy is willing to die rather than surrender." We learned that lesson the hard way. Commander James Stockdale, shot down in 1965, tortured for 7.5 years, released in 1973, receives the Medal of Honor. He later writes, "By my 30th mission I knew the campaign was pointless, but orders are orders, so we flew, we bombed, we died, and it changed nothing." John McCain survives his captivity and becomes a U.S. Senator. He spends the rest of his life grappling with the question, what was the point? Why did we bomb? What did we achieve? The answer he arrives at is uncomfortable. We bombed because we could, because we had the technology, because we believed in technological solutions to political problems. We achieved nothing because the problems were political, not technological. Operation Rolling Thunder stands as a monument to the limits of military power. It demonstrates that destruction is not victory, that capability is not strategy, that superior firepower cannot overcome superior will. The campaign should have taught American military and political leaders that wars are won through strategy, politics, patience, and understanding of the enemy's motivations, not through raw destructive power. Instead, the lesson was forgotten. The belief in technological solutions persisted, and 58,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam, and millions of Vietnamese died, and the war was lost, and the bombing campaign that was supposed to prevent all of that accomplished nothing. The pilots who flew Rolling Thunder missions deserve honor for their courage and professionalism. The POWs who survived years of torture deserve recognition for their sacrifice, but their courage and sacrifice were wasted on a fundamentally flawed strategy. That's not their failure. That's the failure of the leaders who ordered the campaign and refused to admit it wasn't working. That's the failure of a system that measured success in tons of bombs dropped rather than political objectives achieved. That's the failure of a military doctrine that believed firepower could substitute for strategic wisdom. If this story made you think differently about military power and its limits, share it. The pilots who flew these missions, Stockdale, McCain, Rissner, Kassler, and thousands of others, their courage deserves remembering. So does the truth about the campaign they flew. It failed completely. Vietnamization is working, they say. The South Vietnamese can defend themselves. McQuinn sips lukewarm coffee from a canteen cup and watches the fog lift from the hills to the north. Then he hears it, a sound like distant thunder rolling across the landscape. But it's not thunder, it's artillery. Thousands of guns firing simultaneously across the DMZ, Soviet 113 field guns with 30-mile range, 152 howitzers, 122 rockets. The shells start landing 30 seconds later. Explosions walk across the fire base like giant footsteps. The ground shakes so hard McQuinn loses his footing. Dirt and shrapnel rain down. McQuinn dives into a bunker. Through the smoke and chaos, ears ringing from the concussions, he sees something he didn't think was possible anymore. Columns of Soviet T-54 tanks rolling south across the DMZ in broad daylight. Not infiltrating, not hiding. Rolling openly in formation with infantry support, moving down Highway 1 like they own it. North Vietnam isn't conducting guerrilla warfare anymore. They're invading with 200,000 troops, Soviet armor and heavy artillery. This is conventional war, army against army, tank against tank. What happens in the next 7 months will prove three things: that South Vietnam can fight without American ground troops, that American air power can still stop North Vietnamese invasions, and that none of it will matter 3 years from now when the air power is gone and the tanks roll again. If you want the story of the war's final act, the dress rehearsal for defeat, hit that like button and let's watch North Vietnam's final gamble. 4 months earlier, Hanoi, North Vietnam, December 1971. General Vo Nguyen Giap, 62 years old, sits in a windowless planning room studying maps of South Vietnam spread across a large wooden table. Giap is legendary, the man who defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the strategist behind the Tet Offensive in 1968. But he's getting old. His health is failing, heart problems, exhaustion. This offensive might be his last major operation. The strategic situation is clear. American troop withdrawals are proceeding on schedule. Nixon's policy of Vietnamization means South Vietnamese forces are supposed to defend themselves with American air support, but without American ground troops. American public opinion has turned decisively against the war. The Paris peace accords are being negotiated in secret. American combat involvement is ending whether the war is won or not. North Vietnamese leadership faces a deadline. Strike before South Vietnam becomes self-sufficient, before American withdrawals reach the point where intervention becomes politically impossible. Giap's plan is massive and conventional. 3 simultaneous attacks across 300 miles of front, timed for maximum shock effect. First, 4 NVA divisions, the 304th, 308th, 324B, and 312th, totaling 40,000 soldiers, will cross the DMZ and attack toward Hue and Da Nang in the north. Second, 2 divisions will attack from Cambodia into the Central Highlands, striking at Quantum and threatening to cut South Vietnam in half. Third, 3 divisions will attack from Cambodia toward An Loc, a city 70 miles north of Saigon that's the gateway to the capital. Total force committed, 200,000 to 300,000 troops. Equipment: Soviet T-54 tanks, 45 tons, 100 guns, capable of penetrating any South Vietnamese armor. Soviet 130 artillery with 30-mile range. They can shell targets from positions South Vietnam can't reach. Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missiles and ZSU-57-2 mobile anti-aircraft guns to defend against American air attacks. This won't be guerrilla warfare. This will be conventional invasion, organized divisions moving openly, maintaining supply lines, capturing and holding territory. It's a gamble. Casualties will be enormous. But if it works, South Vietnam will collapse before the peace accords are finalized. The offensive has deliberate political timing. The 1972 American presidential election is coming in November. If North Vietnam can demonstrate that Vietnamization has failed, that South Vietnam is collapsing despite American support, American voters might elect a president committed to rapid withdrawal. Democratic candidate George McGovern is calling for immediate withdrawal from Vietnam. If the offensive succeeds, McGovern's position strengthens. If it fails, Nixon's policy is validated. North Vietnamese leadership is gambling that American voters will choose withdrawal over continued commitment. Ho Chi Minh is dead. He died in 1969, but his vision continues. North Vietnamese leadership remains committed to conquest at any cost. They will accept any casualties, any losses, any sacrifices to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. The Easter Offensive will cost tens of thousands of lives. From Hanoi's perspective, it's an acceptable price for potential victory. March 30, 1972, 6:00 a.m. The artillery begins. Thousands of guns firing simultaneously across a 300-mile front from the DMZ to Cambodia. Forward ARVN positions are obliterated in the first minutes. Fire support bases that had stood for years disappear under concentrated bombardment. American forward observers scramble for radios to call for air support, but the weather is terrible. Fog and low clouds hanging at 500 feet prevent air operations. The North Vietnamese planned for this. They studied weather patterns for months and launched during the worst flying conditions of the year, the tail end of monsoon season when clouds make air support impossible. The infantry comes next, not in small units sneaking through jungle like guerrillas, in organized companies and battalions moving openly down roads in formation. Behind them come the tanks. Soviet T-54s, 45 tons, 100 guns, 3.4 inches of armor, capable of crushing bunkers and engaging other tanks. The ARVN has American M48 Patton tanks, adequate but not superior to T-54s. More importantly, ARVN doesn't have enough tanks. The North Vietnamese have concentrated 400 tanks for the offensive. The ARVN has maybe 200 tanks spread across the entire country, not concentrated anywhere. At Camp Carroll, Captain McQuinn watches ARVN soldiers run for cover as artillery pounds the base. Bunkers collapse. Communications trenches cave in. The command post takes a direct hit. 3 men killed instantly. McQuinn grabs his PRC-25 radio and calls Phu Bai, the American airbase 40 miles to the south. "This is Raven 6. We need air support now. Enemy armor advancing in company strength." The response crackles back. "Negative, weather below minimums. No flights authorized. McQuinn realizes they're on their own. He looks at the ARVN soldiers around him, young men, most barely 20 years old, trying to maintain discipline under the heaviest bombardment they've ever experienced. Some are praying, others are checking weapons with shaking hands. By noon, North Vietnamese forces have penetrated 5 miles south of the DMZ. ARVN units are retreating in disorder. Some units fight organized withdrawals, maintaining cohesion, covering each other. Others break and run, abandoning equipment, fleeing south on foot. The coordination and discipline of South Vietnamese forces varies wildly depending on leadership. Some battalion commanders lead from the front and keep their men fighting. Others disappear at first contact. The 56th Regiment at Camp Carroll is ordered to hold. They're surrounded on 3 sides by advancing NVA infantry. T-54 tanks are visible on the ridgeline to the north, dark shapes moving through the fog. April 1, 1972. The situation deteriorates rapidly. Fire Support Base Sarge falls to NVA assault. Fire Support Base Holcomb is overrun. The road south from Camp Carroll to Hue is cut by NVA forces. Camp Carroll is completely isolated. Lieutenant Colonel Pham Van Dinh, commanding the 56th Regiment, calls his superior, Lieutenant General Hong Xuan Lam, commander of I Corps, and requests reinforcements. Lam's response is dismissive. No reinforcements available. Hold your position. Then Lam ends the call. American intelligence later learns that Lam spent that afternoon playing tennis at his headquarters compound in Da Nang, 60 miles from the battle. April 2, 1972. Easter Sunday. Camp Carroll is completely surrounded. The NVA has brought up heavy artillery and is methodically destroying the base. Buildings collapse. Ammunition bunkers explode. The airstrip is cratered and unusable. The death toll mounts: 20, 40, 60 ARVN soldiers killed. Lieutenant Colonel Dinh assembles his senior officers in an underground bunker. The air smells like cordite and sweat. Dinh receives a phone call. The enemy commander is offering surrender terms. Safe passage for those who lay down arms. Prison for those who resist. Dinh faces his 13 senior officers and calls for a vote: fight or surrender. Only one officer votes to continue fighting. 12 vote to surrender. Captain McQuinn and Major Joseph Brown, the 2 American advisors, are stunned. We can hold longer, McQuinn argues. Air support will come when the weather clears. Don't give up. Dinh shakes his head. His face is gray with exhaustion and resignation. My men will all die if we continue. I must think of them. His mind is made up. McQuinn and Brown realize they have minutes to escape. They grab their gear, M16 rifles, radios, maps, and run for the landing zone where a CH-47 Chinook helicopter has been diverted to rescue them. They take 20 ARVN cavalry troopers from the 11th Cavalry Squadron who hadn't been told about the surrender and were still armed. The helicopter lifts off as NVA forces enter the base through the main gate. Camp Carroll, with 22 artillery pieces, quad 50 anti-aircraft guns, ammunition stores, and 1,800 soldiers, surrenders intact. The artillery pieces that weren't spiked will be turned around and used against other ARVN positions. It's the largest ARVN surrender of the war. The fall of Camp Carroll shocks American and South Vietnamese command. If a full regiment can surrender without exhausting its ammunition, without fighting to the last man, how many other units will collapse under pressure? Is Vietnamization working or failing? If stories like this, where courage and cowardice exist side by side in the chaos of war, are what you're here for, tap that like button. This is the real war, not the sanitized version they show on TV. But Camp Carroll isn't the entire story. In other locations, ARVN forces fight with extraordinary courage that validates everything Vietnamization promised. April 7, 1972. In Lac, 70 miles north of Saigon. The city is surrounded by 15,000 North Vietnamese troops from 3 NVA divisions. Inside the city, 5,000 ARVN soldiers commanded by Brigadier General Le Van Hung, a tough career officer who refuses to retreat. The ARVN garrison is outnumbered 3-1. Supplies can only be delivered by helicopter or parachute drop because all roads are cut. NVA artillery, 130 guns positioned in Cambodia beyond South Vietnamese artillery range, pounds the city continuously. Shells fall every few minutes. The constant bombardment creates a permanent haze of smoke and dust. T-54 tanks attack from the north, trying to break through into the city center. ARVN soldiers dig in and fight. They establish defensive positions in concrete buildings. They place anti-tank mines on approach roads. They prepare Molotov cocktails, gasoline-filled bottles, to throw at tanks. American B-52 bombers, called in by American advisors embedded with the ARVN garrison, drop 500-pound bombs on NVA assembly areas outside the city. Each B-52 carries 108 bombs, 60,000 pounds of high explosives. The bombs create craters 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep. NVA infantry formations caught in the open are shredded. Body parts rain down. Trees are obliterated. But the NVA keeps coming. Fresh battalions replace destroyed ones. The offensive has strategic momentum. The NVA attacks with human wave tactics, hundreds of soldiers charging the city perimeter under covering fire from tanks and artillery. ARVN machine guns cut them down. M60 machine guns firing 550 rounds per minute. Bodies pile up in front of ARVN positions. The fighting is close quarters, hand-to-hand in some sections. Grenades thrown from buildings onto advancing infantry below. T-54 tanks reach the city center, diesel engines roaring, tracks clanking on pavement, before being destroyed by American-supplied M72 Law rockets. These are disposable anti-tank weapons, fire once and throw away, that can penetrate Soviet armor at ranges up to 300 meters. American helicopter gunships, Cobra attack helicopters armed with TOW anti-tank missiles, circle the city at 2,000 meters altitude and engage NVA tanks assembling for assault. Each TOW missile costs $10,000 and can destroy a $200,000 Soviet tank from 2 miles away. The gunships fire from outside the range of small arms fire. NVA tanks explode one after another, turrets blown off, ammunition cooking off inside. The wreckage litters the approaches to the city. Burning tanks create black smoke columns visible for miles. The siege of Unlock lasts 66 days. From April 7 through June 11, the ARVN garrison holds. They never surrender. They never retreat. Resupplied by parachute drops that often miss the small drop zone and land in enemy-controlled areas. Supported by American air power that arrives whenever weather permits, outnumbered and surrounded, they defend the city until NVA forces withdraw. It's a triumph of Vietnamization. South Vietnamese forces defending their nation without American ground troops. General Le Van Hung becomes a national hero. His photograph appears on the cover of Time magazine. May 1, 1972. Quang Tri-City, 30 miles south of the DMZ. The city falls to North Vietnamese forces after weeks of fighting. 4 NVA divisions have converged on the provincial capital. The 308th Division attacks from the north. The 304th Division attacks from the west. The 324B Division attacks from the southwest. ARVN defenders, mostly the 3rd Infantry Division and South Vietnamese Marines, are overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They retreat south in disorder. Some units fight organized withdrawals, covering each other, maintaining cohesion. Others break completely and run. Soldiers throw away weapons to run faster. Officers abandon their men. It's the first provincial capital to fall to communists since the war began. The psychological impact is devastating. If Quang Tri can fall, can any city be held? ARVN forces retreat south toward Hue. Refugees flood Highway 1, families fleeing with children, elderly pushed in carts, soldiers mixed with civilians. The column stretches for miles. NVA artillery targets the refugee columns deliberately. Thousands are killed on the roads. Bodies line both sides of Highway 1. The smell of death becomes overwhelming. American commanders watching the situation from headquarters in Saigon make a decision. If South Vietnam is collapsing, American air power will prevent total defeat. President Nixon, informed of the crisis, authorizes Operation Linebacker, a massive bombing campaign targeting North Vietnam supply lines, transportation infrastructure, and military installations. May 8, 1972. Operation Linebacker begins with a televised presidential address. Nixon announces the mining of North Vietnamese harbors and the resumption of intensive bombing. B-52 bombers flying from bases in Thailand and Guam, 6-hour flights each way, strike North Vietnamese transportation networks. Bridges are destroyed. Rail yards are obliterated. Truck parks are incinerated. American fighter bombers, F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs, attack truck convoys moving supplies south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Navy aircraft from 6 aircraft carriers mine North Vietnamese harbors at Haiphong and other ports, cutting off seaborne supply from China and the Soviet Union. The bombing is relentless. Sorties every hour, around the clock, weather permitting. The objective is simple: cut off supplies to the invading armies. Linebacker is fundamentally different from Rolling Thunder, the bombing campaign that ran from 1965 to 1968. Rolling Thunder had political constraints. Certain areas around Hanoi were off-limits. Certain targets were prohibited. Bombing pauses were declared for diplomatic signaling. Linebacker has no such constraints. Nixon has decided that political considerations are secondary to military necessity. Everything that moves supplies south is a target. Rail lines are bombed. Roads are cratered. Bridges are destroyed. Truck parks are obliterated. Fuel depots are incinerated. The tonnage delivered eventually exceeds 500,000 tons, more ordnance than was dropped on Japan in all of World War II. The impact on North Vietnamese logistics is devastating. The invading armies, stretched across 300 miles of front line, dependent on supply lines running from the north through Laos and Cambodia, begin running short of ammunition, fuel, and food. Artillery fire slackens because shells aren't arriving from the rear. Tank advances stall because fuel trucks are being destroyed by airstrikes. Infantry attacks become less frequent because replacement soldiers aren't flowing south fast enough to replace casualties. June 1972. The NVA offensive momentum stops. North Vietnamese forces dig in to consolidate gains. South Vietnamese forces, reinforced and resupplied, begin counterattacking. At An Loc, the siege is broken. NVA forces withdraw toward Cambodia. At Kontum in the Central Highlands, ARVN forces defeat repeated NVA assaults with American air support. Every time NVA forces mass for attack, American aircraft bomb them. The NVA can't concentrate forces without being destroyed from the air. The operational pattern becomes predictable. NVA attacks, suffers heavy casualties from airstrikes, withdraws. ARVN holds or counterattacks. July and August 1972. ARVN forces launch a counteroffensive to retake Quang Tri. The battle is brutal, house to house, block by block fighting similar to Hue in 1968. ARVN Marines, considered the best South Vietnamese forces, lead the assault. They advance street by street, building by building. American advisors call in airstrikes on NVA positions. B-52s crater the city with carpet bombing. Artillery pounds buildings sheltering NVA soldiers. Tank battles erupt in the streets. M48 Pattons engaging T-54s at point-blank range. The fighting lasts weeks. ARVN casualties are heavy, hundreds killed, thousands wounded, but they keep attacking. The momentum has shifted. September 16, 1972. Quang Tri is retaken. The South Vietnamese flag is raised over the citadel, the same citadel where the Viet Cong flag flew during the 1968 Tet Offensive. It's a symbolic victory. The city that fell in May has been recaptured in September. Vietnamization works with American air support, but the cost is staggering. Quang Tri is a ruin. 80% of structures destroyed or heavily damaged. Thousands of civilians dead or displaced. The ARVN suffered 10,000 killed and 50,000 wounded during the 7-month offensive. North Vietnamese casualties are estimated at 40,000 to 75,000 killed. Some estimates go as high as 100,000 when wounded are included. October 22, 1972. The Easter Offensive officially ends. 7 months of fighting, 300 miles of front, 200,000 North Vietnamese troops committed to battle, conventional warfare with tanks, artillery, organized divisions. The result? Stalemate. North Vietnam failed to achieve decisive victory. They captured no major cities permanently. They forced no South Vietnamese surrender. South Vietnam survived but didn't achieve decisive victory either. The ARVN proved they could fight, but they couldn't defeat North Vietnam decisively. The war continues, unresolved, bloody, consuming both nations. But the strategic lesson is unmistakable. South Vietnam can defend itself with massive American air support and continued military aid. Without that air support, the outcome would be very different. This reality will define the next 3 years. November 1972. Richard Nixon is re-elected president in a landslide, defeating George McGovern 520 electoral votes to 17. American voters seem satisfied with Nixon's handling of Vietnam, withdrawing troops while using air power to prevent South Vietnamese collapse. The Easter Offensive, though initially shocking, validated Vietnamization in American eyes. The policy works. South Vietnam can stand on its own. American ground forces aren't needed. That's the narrative Nixon successfully sells. January 27, 1973. The Paris Peace Accords are signed. American forces will withdraw completely within 60 days. North Vietnamese forces can remain in positions they currently hold in South Vietnam, a provision that essentially guarantees eventual North Vietnamese victory because it allows enemy forces to remain on South Vietnamese territory. The war continues between North and South Vietnam, but without American participation. 1970-41975. American aid to South Vietnam is cut by Congress. Military assistance drops from $2.3 billion in 1973 to $700 million in 1975. ARVN forces run short of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. Helicopters are grounded for lack of parts. Artillery units ration shells. The South Vietnamese military, designed to fight with American logistical support, begins to deteriorate. March 1975. North Vietnam launches its final offensive. Without American air support, Congress has prohibited U.S. military operations in Southeast Asia. ARVN forces face North Vietnamese armor without the helicopter gunships and B-52 bombers that saved them in 1972. The result is catastrophic. ARVN defenses collapse. Soldiers flee. Entire divisions dissolve. The roads south are choked with refugees and retreating soldiers. April 30, 1975. Saigon falls. North Vietnam conquers South Vietnam. The war ends in total communist victory. The Easter Offensive was the dress rehearsal. It proved South Vietnam could survive with American air support. It also proved South Vietnam couldn't survive without it. When the air support was withdrawn and American aid was cut, the war was lost within 2 years. Everything defended in 1972 was lost in 1975. Captain James McQuinn, who escaped Camp Carroll during the surrender, returned to the United States in 1973 after the Paris Accords were signed. He worked as a high school history teacher in Boston for 35 years. He never talked about Vietnam except to other veterans. He attended one Vietnam veterans reunion and walked out after 20 minutes. When he died in 2009 from heart failure, his family found letters he'd written but never sent, dozens of letters addressed to soldiers who died in Vietnam. One letter, dated April 3, 1972, the day after Camp Carroll fell, said simply, "We proved we could fight without American ground troops, but we can't fight without American air support. When the planes stop coming, this war ends, and we lose. I know this now as certainly as I know anything. We're not losing because we can't fight. We're losing because we won't keep fighting." The Easter Offensive killed 40,000 to 75,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. It proved Vietnamization could work militarily in the short term. It validated Nixon's policy and helped him win re-election. But it also exposed the fundamental weakness. South Vietnam's survival depended on continued American commitment, not just political rhetoric but actual air support, actual military aid, actual willingness to intervene. When that commitment ended, survival ended. 3 years after the Easter Offensive, the tanks rolled again. This time no B-52s came. No helicopter gunships engaged the armor. No American advisors called in airstrikes. The ARVN fought alone and lost. The Easter Offensive was North Vietnam's final gamble that failed, but it taught them what they needed to know. Wait for American air power to be withdrawn. Wait for American aid to be cut. Then strike with everything. That's exactly what they did in 1975. If this story made you understand why the war was lost before it ended, share it. The soldiers who fought during the Easter Offensive on both sides deserve to be remembered. So does the truth about what their courage couldn't overcome. Which Vietnam battle should we cover next? Drop your answer and where you're watching from in the comments.